Today's guest's day job is in venture capital, working to connect venture capital funds and startups with major corporations. However, it is as his role as founder and publisher of Soultracks.com, America's most popular soul magazine or platform, that I invited him to share the tracks that have helped to inform and inspire his life and career. On Soultracks.com, it states that the platform was launched in his kitchen back in 2003 with the help of one of his four children. The aim, holding the transcripts of a soul music biography show he broadcast on XM satellite radio. Soultracks.com has become one of the most popular specialist online platforms, which attracts some of the most knowledgeable and passionate writers about the soul music genre, which Chris Rizik states makes it a bridge between classic and modern soul. Ralph T. of Expansion Records said, Soultracks has become invaluable, the go-to place for up-to-the-moment news on all that's relevant to the soul music world. I don't mean what is today referred to as R&B by Generation Z, but the classic soul made by artists who were inspired by or yearn to be part of the sophisticated side of Black music. Both veteran and new artists are given tremendous support and profile by Soultracks, and on a daily basis, Chris and his team are there to tell us about what's going on so we don't miss anything. Chris, I wanted to know, where did you get started in soul music and why soul music?
Well, Diane, first, thanks for having me here. It's great being with you today. It all started, I'm the youngest of 7 kids. We grew up in Flint, Michigan, sort of in the shadow of Detroit. And I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And if you were in that area in the 60s and 70s, everything was about Motown. And my family was very musical to begin with. My mother was an opera singer.
No.
And all my siblings sang or played instruments. And when you're the youngest, you're just sort of a sponge, picking up what they do. And so when I was a little kid, I have 5 older brothers and an older sister, and they were always listening to Motown when I was young. And so I kind of grew up with that being the music that was the center of everything. There was music going on constantly in our house, usually in multiple places. And so I grew up in a really musical household. I sang, not professionally, I sang weddings and things like that, but sort of grew up in this household filled with music, and mostly, I mean, well, we covered a lot of things. It was mostly soul music due to the location I was at and the time I was at.
Can you recall exactly the first time you were introduced to music, came across music, and what that moment felt like to you?
Wow, it would be when I was really young, probably 3 or 4 years old, and my siblings had a little portable 45 RPM player and a handful of 45s, and just hearing the stuff they were playing, it wasn't even sort of an aha thing. It was just kind of, that was just life growing up there with that little record player constantly going, even when I wasn't allowed to touch it.
Yeah, something about not being able to touch it, but the joy of feeling something like that and being exposed to music was just such quite a powerful moment, I imagine. I'm interested to learn more about your mother being an opera singer. I worked with an opera singer many years ago. What voice was she, and what did she used to sing?
She was a mezzo-soprano, and she was a pretty incredible woman. So she was a nurse, kind of a pioneering nurse who went around she was based in St. Louis, but she went around the country in the 40s, opening up what now would be called neonatal nurseries, so for babies that were premature. And so she was trained in some of what were then the new methods. So she would travel the country, being assigned to hospitals to help open up neonatal nurseries. But when she was back in St. Louis, she sang with the Metropolitan Opera there.
No.
Also from a very musical family.
And you hint that you also used to sing. So, did you take any of her sort of vocal training and expertise and employ it when you were singing yourself?
Um, I would say I did never sang opera, but I sang some pretty esoteric things. So I sang Gregorian chant for a couple
Wow,
years.
fantastic.
Um, I did sing in a sort of a pop group for a while, and I sang an awful lot of weddings during my time. Wasn't a great singer, but as a 20-year-old or whatever, I was able to get a few gigs here and there.
So, did you ever consider a career in music?
Um, what I really enjoyed, even from the beginning, so even when I was in high school, we had a high school newspaper. I was the first music reviewer in high school. Then I went to Michigan State University, where they had a very well-established newspaper. In fact, it was the largest college newspaper in the country, but they had people who wrote about rock music, but nobody had ever written about soul or R&B. So I approached the editor, when I was 19, and just gave him some samples of my work, and then came on and was the first soul music reviewer in the history of that newspaper. So I considered for a period being involved in music, but as a reviewer or a writer, never really as a singer. I didn't feel I was good enough as a singer.
Let's get on to your first track because I'm eager to learn the reasons why you have chosen this fantastic selection. You've chosen the Four Tops. I can't help myself. Why is that?
Um, there's a lot of songs I could have chosen from my childhood that were being played in the house. I think I chose that because um, I was always a big fan of the Four Tops, because Levi Stubbs, even as a kid, I thought I'd never heard anybody who sang with that kind of power. Um, and so we just always listened to them. And I in particular always listened to him. And still to this day, he probably is my favorite all-time singer, not just because of nostalgia, but just because he was just so unique. And I've actually gotten to know his family, over time now with Soultracks, and a wonderful family. So for a lot of reasons, I gravitate around him, and then around the Four Tops. So it really is sort of my earliest memory of listening to music as a kid, and the Four Tops are probably most representative.
So, what were you like as a child, the youngest of seven? Um, were you spoiled, as they say the last ones normally are?
I would say yes and no. I was spoiled by my siblings more than my parents. Um, my parents used to joke that my feet never touched the ground for the first 3 years of my life because somebody was always carrying me. Um, and so it was just a great house I grew up in. Wonderful siblings who, still to this day, I hear from every sibling every single day. We're texting constantly with each other. So great family, great parents. And so, but because there was so much activity and it was a sort of a loud ethnic family, I ended up really being the quiet one, didn't talk much, because there was enough talking going on for everybody. So uh, as I sort of referenced earlier, I was just more of a sponge, um, listening to everybody, trying to learn from what they did right, trying to learn from what they did wrong. And so I guess, that I would characterize myself as someone who was just a listener as a kid and trying to absorb all these things, particularly from siblings who were older than I was. So, in some ways I was seeing things 5 to 10 years ahead of my peers.
Um, can I ask you to clarify? You used the word ethnic family there. What is your heritage? You did say
Uh,
earlier, but I've
um,
forgotten.
yeah, so all four of my grandparents came from Lebanon.
Wow.
Um, and my father didn't even speak English until he was about 10 years old. So very Lebanese, very Catholic. And where I grew up in, it was like an enclave. I had probably 6 or 7 relatives lived within a block of where our house was. So you were constantly surrounded by this community and by extended family.
Tell us about your father. We know your mother was an opera singer. What did your father get up to?
My father was an entrepreneur, so he was the youngest of 7 also, and he his father died in a tragic crash, the largest crash in Flint history. 9 people died in a train hit a car, and so at a pretty young age, he kind of became, at 14 or 15, he became the leader in the family. So he was kind of larger than life to us, larger than life to the whole community. And he probably, over the course of his career, started at least a dozen companies. You know, some failed, some succeeded, but he was just fearless. And he ended up, you know, continuing on that way. I think the last company he started, he was probably 85 years old. He just couldn't get the sort of the entrepreneurial bug out of his head. So yeah, he was kind of a larger than life character.
On to track 2, Tavares. It only takes a minute.
Yes. So when you're in a big family, you know, at meals, you know, you're fighting for the spot at the table. You're fighting to make sure you get some of the food that's in the pot. When you're in a big musical family, you're fighting for who owns what group or singer. So, you know, sort of when I hit the age when I was really into music, it's weird to say this, all the singers were taken, you know, because, you know, this brother, his favorite was this, my sister, her favorite was this. And when I first heard Tavares, and it was really, it only takes a minute. I had heard them before, but it's the first one I really liked. I found out they were a family group, and I came from this big family. They were 5 brothers, and I had all these brothers, and they weren't yet claimed by any of my siblings as their group. So, so I claimed them as mine, and I started buying everything. I went back and bought their previous stuff, and I started listening constantly to Tavares. And when I had my first position writing on the college newspaper, I sort of weaseled my way in to get an interview with Ralph Tavares. I was 18 at the time, and he was so gracious. And it was a phone interview, and then they were coming to Detroit, so he invited me to interview him in person at the hotel, and then to come backstage with them, which, you know, you're just over the moon at that age. I'm writing for this, at the time, this sort of little newspaper, but getting to meet my favorite group and spend time with them backstage and get to interview them backstage. And I still have those recordings today of me with my little cassette recorder interviewing them. So Tavares became my favorite group. To this day, they're my favorite group. I got to know all the members of the group over the years. And when we get to talking about Soultracks, the way I started Soultracks was the very first article I wrote was a biography of Tavares.
No. How extraordinary. So you're 18. You've just interviewed Ralph Tavares, your favorite band. What else was going on in the world at the time that you can recall? I'm thinking because you're interviewing now, you've become the music reviewer at the school paper. You're considering a career in journalism.
That's exactly right. I was an accounting major, and you probably can't get much different than accounting and journalism. And I was thinking of going to law school also after I got out of school. So a lot of thoughts going through my mind. In the end, you know, I sort of, as I thought about the two, I thought, you know, I'm better at accounting than I am at journalism. And I think it can open more opportunities for me in my career. So I followed that, ended up getting the accounting degree and going to law school. but I never got the journalism bug out of my head. And, it just kind of stayed there in the back of my mind, for another, gosh, close to 20 years. And the music thing never left. So even as I'm studying accounting, I'm constantly writing articles for the paper. And after I graduated, I no longer had this outlet to write. My poor girlfriend, later my wife, she just had me doing it all orally, and reviewing things as I was hearing them while we were in the car. And I'll get more back to kind of how she influenced me to do Soultracks later. But yeah, so I never lost the bug for telling people what I thought about music, or always hearing, wanting to be the first to hear new music coming out.
So where were you studying accountancy by this time?
So this was at Michigan State University. Then I graduated, worked briefly. It's a big firm called PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's a big international firm. I worked there for a period, and then I went to law school at the University of Michigan, graduated from that, and to study law.
Particularly what field of law?
It was actually business law.
Okay.
Which would come into play later. And then started in a law firm in downtown Detroit and stayed there and became a partner. And that was my life for the next 12 years, that and us having 4 kids. And I went through what I sort of call my, I don't know what you call it, my lost period of music. We had 4 kids in 8 years, and everything was work or the kids. And I sort of lost track of what was going on the radio. I certainly couldn't follow. I listened to music when I could, but I wasn't on top of it like I had been for so many years, because I just had, I was trying to get to sleep when I could with all those kids, and when I wasn't working. So I just couldn't get the time to, other than maybe listening to Casey Kasem. That's about all I could do to keep up with music.
There's a name from the past.
Right.
What great shows he used to do. So did any of your other siblings follow music as a career, or just you?
I had a brother who became a professional musician for a while. And he traveled the country playing guitar, was a session musician on a few albums. Ultimately, he also went to law school and became a lawyer, and then just sort of played in a local band after that. I had another brother who was a great singer, and he dabbled. He sort of was a professional musician while he was also in college. He ended up going to medical school and becoming this world-class cardiologist, but he still would record on weekends, and he now has a daughter who's a professional singer. So, and the rest of us just sort of sang when we could.
The family comes across to me as driven. Where do you think that comes from?
It goes back to, we're an ethnic family. My parents, my father was never able to afford to go to college. First generation American, wasn't able to go to college. And my mother came from the opposite. She came from a family where everybody went to college and graduate school. So from both sides, we had parents for whom our education was their number one priority. I think they started saving to help us with our education from the day they got married. And the most important thing in our lives, more than anything else, was us getting an education. So 7 kids, all have college degrees, 6 have graduate degrees. So that was probably the most important. Really, it was education and faith were the 2 things that were the most important things to them in raising us.
You did mention that you were brought up Catholic, so I want to ask where faith sits in your life now.
Oh, it's essential. My wife and I built a house 1 block from our church 10 years ago. And so we're certainly regular churchgoers, but sort of more than that, it drives a lot of decisions. When I came to some career decisions, every major decision is usually spent, a fair amount of deliberation happens in church. That's just kind of the way life has gone for me. And, my best decisions have been made in that situation, just going and contemplating and praying about stuff, even including Soultracks. I mean, a lot of the decisions of where I was going to take it came from going to church or a chapel and just praying about it and trying to listen.
Has your faith ever wavered?
Wavered would be a strong word. There's times where I seem to understand it less than others. And, I guess I would say I was brought up in a time in the church when education about the faith wasn't at its strongest. There was a period in most churches in the 70s in particular where a lot of it was, God's just a really awesome guy, but you don't really learn, that's a pretty facile look at faith. And it actually took, as an adult, me sort of doing it on my own because of kind of the lack of catechesis I had in some ways growing up. So I didn't understand it as well as I do now. I certainly don't have it down pat. But I would say that was more of a challenge than it actually wavering.
We're on to track 3, Michael Jackson. Wow, what a track this is, Rock With You.
Yeah, probably maybe my favorite album ever, Off the Wall. And it just sort of hit at that point. It's a time when I was an active reviewer and absorbing all the music. And I grew up with Motown, then Philadelphia, and the sound of Philadelphia came in. And then hearing what Quincy Jones did with this song and this album just kind of blew my mind. He just brought so many elements together. It was for me, this is sort of the peak of my music loving days, when it just seemed like everything that was out I loved. And this song and that album, Off the Wall, were kind of at the top of it. So to me, when I think about my 4 years of college reviewing, this is probably the centerpiece of this. It's right about the time that Off the Wall came out and Rock With You.
Where are you next with your career at accountancy and law?
I'm working really long days and changing diapers and coaching basketball, for the older ones and kind of all that. So that's kind of my life. And music is, other than trying to play my music for my kids, trying to, brainwash them into liking the music I like. Music is kind of an aside. And then what happens is, I'm sure you know David Nathan.
Yes, the lovely David Nathan.
So David has, on his soulmusic.com site, and I'm still going out and trying, the internet's new. And so I'm just going out and trying to read things as I can, because it's just, I didn't have to wait for my monthly Soul Express magazine. I'm able to actually go online and find stuff. And I find David's website and reading it pretty religiously. And one day he sends out, I can't remember if he put it on the site or if it was an email. He said, I want to solicit writers to write biographies of acts, and I'm going to post it on my site. And so I thought, well, I'm going to write one about Tavares. And so I write one pretty good, and I send it into David, and he posts it. And at the end of the post is my email address. And it's up there. I'm happy it's up there. I think everything's done. And then I get an email from a guy named Bobby Bennett, who hosted Soul Street, which was XM Radio's soul music channel. And he said, I really like your writing. Would you like to do a radio show? And I said, wow, I mean, I've got busy at work. I've got all these things going. I don't think so. And my wife, who's been the victim of me constantly talking about music for the years we've been married, she said, what are you talking about? You got to say yes to this. This is all you think about in your spare time is music. So I changed my mind, thanks to her. And I said yes. And so I did a couple shows, and they had these very strict rules. It's like, we want you to sort of write a biography, but we want you to actually read it. So I had to get equipment to record it, read it, put it in MP3 format, and send it to us, and then we'll add music around it and we'll put it up. And so I did it for Tavares, and I did a few more after that. And it was going okay. It just wasn't, I don't have a radio voice. You have a great radio voice. I have a terrible radio voice. And I said, what I really like to do is write. So I thought, well, first thing I'll do is I've written these transcripts for these shows I've done. I'd like to put them up on the web. So I went on eBay, found this program called Microsoft Front Page. I found a used copy for $50. And then Memorial Day weekend, 2003, my then 12-year-old son and I stayed up all night trying to figure out how to use this thing to build a website. And I built a page overnight with the Tavares transcript. I mean, I'll send it to you another time, Diane. It's the ugliest thing you have ever seen. It's just horrible. But it was up. And I figured out how to post it on the internet. And then I posted the Spinners one I did and the Four Tops one I did. And it was kind of fun. So I decided, I was doing a lot of traveling then. And I decided, why don't I, on weekends or when I'm on planes, why don't I just write more of these biographies? I'm not going to do the XM show anymore. It's just, that's not what I want to do. What I want to do is write. And so I just started writing these biographies and posting them up more for myself than anything. And then I got up to 10 and 20 biographies. And then one day, I just thought, I wonder if anybody's looking at this. So I went to, I looked on the analytics for the site, and it was like, wow, last month 1,000 people came to read this. Crazy. So then I started, a little competitive. So I thought, maybe I can do something with this. And so I started reaching out to other websites, to David and to Toby Walker at his website, and asked, would you link to my site? I'll link to yours. And then the next thing I know, wow, 10,000 people are coming to my site. And I'm writing more and more of these things. And then, at some point, all of a sudden I look and there's 50,000 people a month coming to my site, which is crazy. So now I'm really writing it. Then record companies start contacting me. Would you review music? Okay, so I start, in addition to the biographies, this was pre-Wikipedia. So I knew a little bit about search engine optimization. So I was able to figure out how to, there were a lot of websites out there, but I wanted to architect my site so it was really easy to find things for people on the site. And it was really easy for Google to find. And so suddenly, if you type in the Four Tops on Google, the number one thing that comes up is my site. So that's sort of driving traffic to the site. So then I started doing reviews. And then I started people contacting me, can we advertise on your site? I've never even thought about that.
Wow.
So start doing that. And then at some point I come to, I'm at the limits of what my $50 Microsoft Front Page program could do. And so I need to get a professional to design this. And so I make two decisions. One, I'm going to have it professionally designed so that it's like a real, cutting edge website. Two, I'm running out of time to write all these things myself. and I'm doing more reviews. Why don't I start bringing in some writers? Fortunately, I have some advertisers. I'll use the advertising money to pay for the writers. So that's 2007. I'm doing that, and the site just takes off. So it's doing great. I bring in a handful of writers, some of whom are still writing for me now, and just start doing that. Everything's kind of going along swimmingly. I'm front page on everything Google, all's great. And then Wikipedia comes. And I didn't think anything of it until all of a sudden my traffic drops in half. Because anybody who types in the name of an artist isn't getting referred to Soultracks, they're getting referred to Wikipedia. And they've got people contributing from all over the world. There's no way I can keep up with that. So I do one of many iterations of the site. Now we're going to do reviews. We're going to do a few interviews, stuff like that. You know, things get better again. And then, you know, the next thing that happens is people stop they stop reading so much on their computers. Now they're reading on their phones. And a long form review of 1,000 words, nobody's going to read it. Or very few people are going to read it. So now we start thinking about, okay, let's focus more on short, succinct articles about individual songs. Because now Spotify and the streaming services are coming, and people are more singles focused than albums focused. So again, we shift the site to focus on what we call first listen stories, where we will debut a song by an artist they know or by an artist they should know, and short things you can read on your phone. And a lot of the artists we first covered are getting more senior. Some are passing, but some are recording less. And a big part of, and this is going to get to the next song, is there's a new generation of artists that are coming out. How can we bridge this audience that may have listened to Donny Hathaway and introduce them to Frank McComb? You know, how do we take this audience that there's nothing on terrestrial radio that is appealing to them, because it's turning to hip hop and sort of a modern R&B that may not appeal to people in their 40s or 50s. How do we let that audience now find that there is a new generation of artists who are going to appeal to them? You're just not hearing them on the radio. Can we be the source of bridging those generations and allowing those people who want to hear music to know that they don't have to listen to 20-year-old music. They can listen to new music.
So, Cooly's Hot Box. Why this choice?
Cooly's Hot Box. So the revelation came to me. I was going to a parent-teacher conference. And what happened is, in a class, the teacher was a big music fan. And he was talking to my son's class. My son, I think, was a freshman at a little Jesuit school in Detroit. And the teacher started talking about the group, the Persuasions, 60s acapella, 60s and 70s acapella group. And the class, of course, gave him this blank look. And my son, because I had indoctrinated him over the years, absolutely knew the Persuasions and said something about them. And the teacher's mind was blown because he couldn't believe any of these students in the 2000s knew about the Persuasions. So at the parent-teacher conference, I want to talk about my son's class. Teacher wants to talk to me about music. And we had this great conversation. We did talk about the class too, but we talked about music. And he gave me a stack of CDs to listen to. Actually sent them with my son, because he said, I want you to listen to some stuff. And there were artists that I didn't even know, right? Cooly's Hot Box, Eric Roberson, Guapale, you know, lots of other of the independent soul music scene that was rising in the early 2000s. You know, kind of a lot of the neo soul artists. And so I took it home and, again, blew my mind. I didn't even know these artists existed. This was right about maybe year one of Soultracks that this was happening, maybe year two. And I just started listening to them, and that made me want to listen more. And Cooly's Hotbox was the first of those CDs that I listened to. And I heard Angela Johnson for the first time. I heard Christian from Tortured Soul for the first time when they were in that group. And it just opened up this whole new world for me. That became the future of Soultracks, which was highlighting, covering the classic soul artists, but also highlighting independent soul artists and becoming like the fortress for independent soul music artists in a world that really wasn't giving them outlets.
So you still hadn't taken the hint that music could be your potential career. Where did you get into venture capitalism?
So I had an interesting thing happen. I got recruited. Somebody I had worked with back at PricewaterhouseCoopers, probably the smartest person I know. He left there and actually led. I don't know if you remember the computer company Gateway.
Yes. So
he was the president of Gateway. He left PricewaterhouseCoopers to become the president of Gateway, and then he wanted to move back to Michigan to raise his family, and he wanted to start a venture capital fund. I knew nothing about venture capital. But he contacted me because I was the attorney he knew in town from 10 years earlier when we had worked together. And so I helped him start a venture capital fund. And really the idea is you're helping local entrepreneurs who have a great idea, try and turn it into something, almost like Shark Tank, but not really like Shark Tank. A lot nicer than that. But trying to help them. Usually they need help with ideas and they need help with money. And so that's what he wanted to do. So I started helping him as his attorney to start this. And then he recruited me away from the law firm. And what he was doing was way more exciting to me than what I was doing. The ability to help these people with great ideas, help them materialize, was really exciting. So I got into venture capital, and I was doing venture capital at the time I started Soultracks. And I was able to do them both for several years. Then I came to this weird crossroads. After us working together for several years, he said he wanted to go into politics. And he actually became the governor of our state, of Michigan. And that left me in this career quandary. What do I do next? Could I actually make Soultracks my career? Or do I want to do something different? And so went back to church like I always did, started praying about it. And what I realized is what I loved about Soultracks was I could do what I wanted to do without worrying about, can it support my lifestyle? I didn't have to worry with Soultracks. I needed to earn enough to pay my writers, but I didn't need to worry about anything else. And I thought, for me to make Soultracks something that becomes a big moneymaker, I'm gonna have to compromise on a lot of things. And it would turn what is this thing that is so fun to me, it would turn it into a chore. Like if I wanted to turn it into a lifestyle, website. First of all, I'm not qualified to do that. Secondly, it's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to celebrate independent soul music. So why don't I leave that as my nights and weekends hobby, where it's still going to be just so much fun. And then I decided to create something new. If you live in the middle of the country in the US like I do, it's tough. It's tough for a founder to get venture capital. And I had sort of seen that for my years. And so I created a new organization called Renaissance, and the name is sort of indicative. The idea was a renaissance of places in the middle of the US, industrial places, that would allow entrepreneurs to raise capital so that they could fulfill their dreams. And so we did something. Renaissance was the first organization of its kind in the world, where the idea was get these, these sources of money on the West Coast and on the East Coast, et cetera, get them to bring their capital to Detroit, and help founders here be able to raise the money they need to create companies. And the idea being, you know, these large investors are sitting on the coasts. They don't realize it isn't charity to come to Detroit. It's just good business. And what we've kind of proven over the last 15 years is it's worked out great. We've actually taken this thing that we built here and we've helped replicate it in other cities in the center of the country, Cincinnati, Houston, Milwaukee. We've helped other groups. We've just sort of opened up our idea to any place that wants it. So you can help entrepreneurs, largely diverse entrepreneurs who wouldn't be able to attract capital to their ideas, and it opens it up for them. And it's sort of disproven the myth that you have to be on the coasts and that you have to only have an entrepreneur that looks a certain way in order to be successful. What we've proven is that it can happen. There's a saying that talent is dispersed everywhere, but opportunity isn't. And our idea was to create opportunities in other parts of the US. And it's worked out great because what's happened is a lot of opportunity has been created. In Michigan, over $2 billion worth of opportunity has been created by our work. And we've disproven that it's charity. Everybody who's invested here has done really well investing in these underserved parts of the country. So I've talked too long about that. I apologize, but I'm kind of passionate about it.
That shows. I want to get on to track 5, Gordon Chambers.
Yes. So once we made the embrace of highlighting independent music, one of the first people I met was Gordon Chambers, a singer-songwriter from Brooklyn. And he had sent me his CD in the mail, loved it, wrote about it. And then he came to Detroit and he was coming to a local record store. So I went and met him, brought 2 of my kids. He couldn't have been nicer to my kids. And he became sort of another passageway, sort of indicative of these years in the 2000s when we sort of went all in on independent soul music. And I mean, another thing about Gordon is he wrote a song called If It Wasn't For Your Love, which was a hit for Heather Headley. And he gave me the track for that for me to record for my anniversary to my wife. And so he became a friend. And actually my 25th anniversary gift to my wife was I went to a recording studio with Gordon's track and sang that for her and presented it to her on our anniversary. So he became a friend and really an admired songwriter for me, but sort of indicative of that period at Soultracks when we really decided we were going to do all things to help independent artists, including the Soultracks Awards. So there's the Grammys, which have been around forever, but tend to go to major label artists. And then your idea was, could we be part of sort of this parallel universe that gives all the things, you know, the major newspapers, the Grammys, terrestrial radio, they all cater to major label artists. Could we be part of this ecosystem that you're part of, that, you know, radio, independent radio, independent, content sites like Soultracks, geared toward independent artists, but there were no awards. And so we created the Soultracks Readers' Choice Awards in 2006, I think, with the idea that we would give awards every year, like the Grammys, Best New Song, Best New Album, Male Artist, Female Artist, etc. But in order to be eligible, you had to be an independent artist. So it became the first awards of its kind, geared toward this group of artists. So we kind of went all in on this. And so the Reader's Choice Awards has actually become a pretty big event annually in the independent music world.
Very quickly, because I'm losing signal, tell us about track 6, Eric Roberson.
Eric Roberson. So Eric he's become a friend, and he is the king of independent soul. He's successful as a writer for major label artists, but he sort of created a pathway for independent artists to have successful careers. So many independent artists have to have side jobs or day jobs, and then they perform at night. He created a pathway to have a successful career as a performing independent artist. He sells CDs well. He sells out wherever he goes around the world in concert. He's a great writer. It just so happens that his album Lessons won the most recent album of the year in the Soultracks Reader's Choice Awards. He's also become a mentor to countless independent artists. So just a terrific person, but a great artist that I think he's indicative of what we cover now. This independent soul music world has matured over the course of the past 20 years. And he's sort of the template of how a career can be made, a really intelligent, thoughtful, well-performed music for adults. We don't kid ourselves. I look at the demographics of our readers, and certainly we have readers in their 20s, but it's the readers and listeners in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who don't have a place to go. And what I think we've shown, and what Lessons is a good example of, is there's music that's aimed at those people, and there's sites like ours and others that are aimed at those people to say, just because you hit 40 doesn't mean now you just listen to oldies. There is a place for you in the recording world, in the concert world, and in the immersion into music. And so that's where Lessons comes in.
Ever thought about setting up a record label?
I've been asked that several times. The problem is time. Again, if I did it, I'd have to partner with somebody who knew what they were doing, because I don't necessarily know that. But I'm kind of up to here now. My kids are grown up enough that I don't have children at home. The last one graduated from college last year, so we're empty nesters. But I sort of have my day job, which is pretty time consuming, and I have Soultracks, which is extremely time consuming also. And I'm pretty happy with my work-life balance right now. I think the record label will be just enough to put me over the edge.
I was going to ask you what's next for you.
I think in both Soultracks and at Renaissance, it's really growing these things. There's a common theme. What we do is in both is there are people who wouldn't be connected, whose natural paths don't connect. In my day job, it's people on the coast and people in Michigan. In Soultracks, it is soul music fans who wouldn't know these artists exist. And the connecting thing in everything that I do in all of these is trying to continue to connect people and make these connections that sort of create wins for everybody. Fans can find new artists they like. Artists can find fans that can give them a career. And just a lot of satisfaction. And the number of emails I get from people sort of thanking us, and even more than me, our writers who are finding lots of music and who are the backbone of what we do. I'm blessed to have a number of writers who've been with us over a decade, who are extremely talented and who do just such a great job. But this, the number of emails we get thanking us, either artists thanking us for giving them exposure they couldn't get, or fans thanking us for letting them hear new music that moves them, goes back to your whole premise about this. Fans remember, what was I listening to when I met this person, in my life? What was I listening to when this good thing or bad thing happened? And we're just giving them a whole new world of music that can drive emotions and help make all of our lives better. That's the goal.
Final question. I'm intrigued that this young school journalist gets a music column. What would you like to go back and tell him?
Wow, that's a great question. I think what I would like to tell him is, don't be scared. Follow what you want to do and work hard at it. Trust your instincts. Yeah, don't be scared to take chances. Again, if you follow the train I talked about, if it weren't for my wife telling me to do the XM radio thing, none of this since then would have happened. And it probably was over caution on my part rather than, being willing to take a chance. And that chance I took has turned out just to be so rewarding for it. But, I was probably overly cautious, and my wife, who knew me better than I did, told me, take the chance.
It's been fantastic interviewing you. Thank you so much. You've got some great stories, and it's been amazing to hear about the development and progress of Soultracks. Well done, you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing this, Diane. You are an amazing interviewer. You listen
Really?
so well. Yeah, for sure. For sure.